Washington, D.C.'s train system was built wheelchair accessible, years before the Americans with Disabilities Act. The accessibility of the train system is actually the primary reason I could see myself retiring to the DC area in a few decades. But it almost wasn't built to be wheelchair accessible. The story of how this happened is one of activism, and it's one worth telling. Transit systems built through the mid 20th century in the United States were not made with people with disabilities in mind. This means that older American subways, such as the ones you'd see in New York, Boston, Philadelphia, and Chicago, tended not to have elevators in their stations, and often didn't have escalators. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if these systems were specifically designed to exclude people with disabilities. I'm sounding cynical, but I'm cynical for a reason. The reason is that, at the time these systems were built and expanded, many local cities and towns made it clear that people with disabilities were not wanted, and not wanted to be seen. This sentiment was captured in the ugly laws some cities had, which made it illegal for certain people perceived as ugly to be seen in public. Among the people perceived as ugly were people with visible disabilities. These ugly laws are an ugly stain on American history, and it's a stain not talked about enough in classrooms. I bring up the ugly laws to highlight the societal context in which many earlier American metro systems were built. These pre World War II systems were built in a context where the preference was probably to keep people with visible disabilities out of sight of those riding these systems. I also bring these ugly laws up to highlight the context in place when DC's metro system was planned. Planning started in the 1960s, at a time when some cities and towns still had these laws in place. Despite that, DC metro stations incorporate a number of accessibility elements. Those accessibility elements included the following, according to an article from Greater Washington. Quote, the white granite strips along platform edges, designed to contrast in color and texture with the red tile platforms, making them more visible to those who have trouble seeing. Flashing lights on platform edges to indicate approaching trains to those who have trouble hearing. And escalators so that passengers with mobility limitations would not need to climb stairs. End quote. You might notice something missing from this list of accessibility elements. Something called elevators. Elevators that wheelchair users need. Elevators that would make travel on subway systems impossible for wheelchair users if they didn't exist in stations. But not just wheelchair users. Many people with canes and crutches have a hard time with escalators as well. And this was pointed out by disability advocates as they pushed the leadership of WMATA, the transit agency in DC responsible for work on DC's system, to have elevators in its plans for stations. The House Committee on Public Buildings and Grounds agreed with disability advocates, and therefore recommended that something called inclinators be built. Inclinators, for the record, are elevators that operate at an incline like escalators. At that point, it seemed like a compromise was reached between disability advocates and WMATA. Except there were a couple of issues. First, even though WMATA designed a prototype inclinator, stations continued to be designed without elevators. And second, the Urban Mass Transportation Administration, the predecessor to the Federal Transit Administration, denied WMATA a grant for said inclinator prototype. According to Greater Washington, the reason for that was, and I quote, Metrorail stations were so architecturally distinct that an inclinator developed by WMATA would not be useful for other systems. End quote. The reasoning sounds bizarre to me, though perhaps an architect or expert on inclinators could shed some light on this reasoning. And if you're able to shed some light, please let me know in the comment section below. In the aftermath of this news from the federal government, Jackson Graham, the first general manager of WMATA, dropped all plans for inclinators or elevators for the entire rail system. Some of the rationale from him was typical bureaucratic speak. He argued that WMATA didn't have the money for this, and that it's expensive relative to the number of people who would use it, and that it seemed like an especially big waste of money to him because he thought that elevators would move more slowly than stairs or escalators. But the most bizarre of his arguments was his claim that all people with disabilities, including wheelchair users, could use escalators, thus making elevators unnecessary. Graham was so adamant about this point that he demonstrated himself that one could use a variety of mobility devices while using WMATA's escalators, including a wheelchair. A group of disability advocates also thought that Graham's reasoning was not only a bizarre stunt, but downright wrong. The most notable of these advocates was someone by the name of Richard Hedinger, himself a wheelchair user working in government at the time. Hedinger used public hearings held by WMATA to ask people at WMATA when they are going to have those supposed inclinators. He didn't get clear answers, perhaps because of the denial of funding for said inclinators, as well as the lack of willingness of Graham to find an alternative solution when funding for inclinators was denied. Eventually, Hedinger had enough of the lack of clarity, so he filed a lawsuit against WMATA in 1972. The law he used in the suit was the Architectural Barriers Act of 1968, which, quote, stipulates that all buildings which are 1. Financed with federal funds, and 2. Intended for use by the public, or which may result in employment or residence therein of physically handicapped persons, be designed and constructed in accordance with the standards prescribed by the ABA to ensure that such buildings are fully accessible to and usable by handicapped individuals. End quote. I think it was smart of Hedinger and other activists to use this law because, well, WMATA did get federal funds and was intended for use by the public. As such, to my way of thinking, it sounds like the law dictated that WMATA train stations needed to be accessible for people with disabilities. And courts looking at this lawsuit agreed with my and Hedinger's interpretation of the law. In October 1973, Richard Hedinger won an injunction that forbade WMATA from, quote, commercially operating any station of the Metro Railway Transportation System until WMATA installs and makes operational all those facilities, including elevators, as may be necessary to ensure that physically handicapped persons will have ready access to and use of such Metro Railway System station. End quote. While disability advocates in WMATA battled in courts about the specifics of the injunction in the following few years, Hedinger said in a 2000 interview that the injunction was key because it forced WMATA to build stations with elevators. And that is how we ended up with elevators at every WMATA station. But it doesn't mean that the elevator situation in Washington's train system is perfect. For example, many of the first wave of stations were built extensively before elevators were required by law, meaning that with some of the older stations, it's pretty clear that the elevators are an afterthought. Additionally, stations don't usually have redundant elevators, meaning that you are doomed if you're a wheelchair user and the one elevator available to get you down to a particular platform is broken. These issues were highlighted in a video made by YouTuber Classy Whale and narrated by Bryce Maples, who was a student at George Washington University at the time, a transit fan, and a wheelchair user due to muscular dystrophy. I'll try and remember to link this video down in the description below. so that you hear a personal take on what DC Metro's accessibility situation is like these days. Or at least what it was like when the video was released in early 2023. Even with these imperfections, though, I am grateful for the advocacy to make DC's train system accessible. I'm grateful for this advocacy because, as far as I know, systems built after DC's tended to be wheelchair accessible. I think it's fair to say that DC was a turning point when it came to the accessibility of American train systems. Thanks to Hedinger and other advocates, countless Americans are able to travel to and from work, school, and other places by train. I'm also grateful for the advocacy because such advocacy should give supporters of mass transit hope that it is possible to successfully push for our transit systems to be better. And the fact that people like me and people like some of my viewers can hold on to that hope is quite significant. And on that note, I ask people to press the like button and subscribe to my channel for more content on imagining better rail transit in the United States. Also remember to press the bell icon so that you're notified when new videos come out. Thank you and have a good day.